I wish that would say something like, "You may speak now." I wonder if we could make a recommendation to the people at Zoom. You're going to need to imagine this, because if you look out the window right now, there is simply a lovely winter day outside. You may even notice a person or two walking along the river who neglected to come up the bank to attend church. That's okay. They're worshiping in their way. But I need you to imagine this, because what I'm about to say would make no sense otherwise. Look up at the miracle of the falling snow. The air, a dizzy maze of whirling, eddying flakes, noiselessly transforming the world. The exquisite crystals dropping in ditch and gutter and disguising in the same suit of spotless livery all objects upon which they fall. So wrote naturalist John Burroughs, and he continued, how novel and fine the first drifts. The old dilapidated fence is suddenly set off with the most fantastic ruffles, scalloped and fluted after an unheard of fashion. Looking down a long line of decrepit stone wall, in the trimming of which the wind had fairly run riot, I saw for the first time what a severe yet master artist old winter really is. When I left church last Wednesday evening, after a program here in the sanctuary, the parking lot was covered with a beautiful blanket of snow. It was a delightful surprise, since I hadn't seen the weather forecast, nor had I noticed the snow begin. And because Peter Hill Carroll had thoughtfully swept the snow off my car, I was able to pause for a moment to enjoy the sight. But not for too long, since the snow was still falling, and it was falling rapidly, and I didn't want to see Peter's kindness go to waste. It was beautiful, though, utterly beautiful. The glistening white snow upon the ground, its accents on the branches of the trees, the flakes falling through the air, and the frost on the windows of the church. It was a conspiracy of beauty. Even the smell of the air seemed a little more, purer than usual. And I briefly felt like I might be a character in a Norman Rockwell painting, standing on the steps of the church as the snow fell around me. Like the proverbial olive, winter is an acquired taste for many. But if you do acquire the taste for it, only in the winter, says Ruth Stout, can you have longer, quiet stretches when you can savor yourself. Amidst the frigid cold and dark nights, it is easy to miss the beauty and the bounty of this season, its warmth and its blessings. In this land of long, rather vivid winters, we can embrace the season or retreat from it, but we cannot ignore it. I will confess that I mostly enjoy winter as a spectator, nestled safely within the warmth and comfort of indoors. It would be easy enough to feel guilty about this at certain times and in certain circumstances, but it does allow me to appreciate the season without feeling burdened by it. As Edith Sitwell wrote, winter is the time for comfort, for good food and warmth, for the touch of a friendly hand, and for a talk beside the fire. It is a time for home. And it is these very pleasures she identifies that allow me to appreciate and even savor the winter months. On the coldest days of winter, it's easy to admire and perhaps even envy those creatures who hibernate at this time of year. Bears are the most famous hibernators of all, and the bear who sometimes wanders through our yard north of Gimli, whom I have never seen, but who leaves evidence of its presence, is quite absent in the winter months, evidently preferring somewhere else to lay its head while the snow covers the ground. I know that my friend Joel's farm was one of the places where bears like to hibernate, much to his peril in the springtime as he set about seeding. Our chipmunks disappear for the winter as well, nestling in wood piles and planters for their long winter sleep, which is actually a state of torpor rather than true hibernation. Only the squirrels and the crows join the deer who wander through our yard the whole year round. While here in the city, the rabbits are everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Humans don't hibernate, although many would like to. And medical researchers have reportedly explored whether or not an induced state of hibernation might be helpful in treating certain illnesses, while those who dream of space travel imagine using hibernation to conserve resources on long journeys through space. I might volunteer myself for such medical research, particularly the kind that would help in treating illnesses, although I have little or no interest in traveling to space. While hibernating, awake, or sound asleep, it doesn't matter. But humans don't hibernate, at least not the way that bears and rodents do. Gerald G. May maintained that Native Americans in the Southwest, whose winters are arguably a lot more pleasant than ours, nevertheless enter a phase of keeping still in this season, staying inside and quieting their activities just as animals and plants enter into their own repose. This isn't hibernation, but it does represent a change of behavior that is attuned to the season, conserving energy, both physically and emotionally, and relaxing alongside the rest of nature. I long ago made my peace with all four seasons, which is good for me because none of the seasons cares what we think about them. So we have the choice of dreading them, enduring them, or embracing them. I choose to embrace them all. Indeed, I try to savor them, for each season in turn represents its unique challenges and delights. And the benefits are mixed. We all know that in the depths of winter, clear usually means cold. So if we are going to claim the sunshine, we may wish to do so with an extra layer of clothing. Just the opposite of what we might do on a sunny summer day. In contrast, when the skies are overcast and perhaps ready to release the snow, the temperatures are often more pleasant, even though the days may be less bright. Sunny and warm is for the summer months. So winter calls for different choices when we are deciding whether to spend the day inside or out. In her meditations, Divine and Moral, Anne Bradstreet, the premier poet among the Puritans, wrote, "If we had no winter, the spring would not be so pleasant. If we did not sometimes taste of adversity, prosperity would not be so welcome." A sentiment echoed and enhanced 2 centuries later by the Unitarian minister Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who said, "How many lessons of faith and beauty we should lose if there were no winter in our year." But it's impossible to avoid comparing it to the other seasons. And although it is arguably the least popular season among those who have not learned to embrace it, winter stands on its own merits as a season I would not choose to do without. Keep your tropical paradises. I cannot imagine heaven without a winter, although the old Norse imagined hell to be a place with only that season. When I was still in high school, I began work in the lumber yard at Winnipeg Supply, my first career, or so I thought, but not my first job. As a 17-year-old and the lowest employee in the pecking order, I spent most of my working hours outside, unloading boxcars, stacking and unstacking lumber, shoveling gravel and sand, running items back and forth between the office, the store, and the warehouse. In the springtime and autumn, it was quite pleasant, but it was hot and dusty in the summer. And when the first winter arrived, it proved to be bitterly cold. I worked evening shifts since I was still in school, so it was even colder than it was during the daytime when the sun was shining. When I had the chance to move from the yard to the lumber shed, I grabbed it, not quite realizing that the half-moon corrugated steel building could be even colder than it was outdoors. It reminded me of one summer when a group from this church spent a late summer night out at the Noisa Unitarian camp, but it turned cold before the weekend began, and I was sure my kidneys were frozen by the middle of the night. We kept moving to stay warm, and my 2 winters in the lumber shed still make me shiver all these years later. Being a teenager, I was originally resistant to dressing for the winter, literally being too cool to try to stay warm. But I soon learned the value of long underwear, flannel shirts, and goofy hats. They say that pride comes before the fall. And if that were a reference to the season, we might say that pride disappears altogether in the winter. At least it does if you spend a big part of the day or evening outside. Eventually, I got an inside job in the paint department where both paint cans and paint clerks had to be kept from freezing. So I returned to the foolish attire of a young adult, as cool as ever, which made the walk to and from work unbearable, but at least I was cozy while helping customers make terrible mistakes about interior decorating. From there, it was into management, where the only cold I was expected to endure was in my heart. Looking back, I'm now grateful for this experience, which forced me to work outdoors during each season of the year, even if it was relatively short-lived. I've always better appreciated the construction crews I pass along the road, the letter carrier who brings my mail, and the first responders who are on the scene when something goes awry. Of course, weather remembered is often more pleasant than weather currently being experienced. But there is something exhilarating about living through extreme weather, especially once you've lived through it. And as I approach my dotage, I sometimes sneer at what the CBC deigns to call a blizzard. Ha! They don't know what a blizzard is until they've walked uphill to school and back both ways, facing heavy snow and harsh winds before heading to the lumber yard for the evening shift because the weather meant there would be a run on sandbags and space heaters, garbage mitts, and extension cords. That's a blizzard. A decade after leaving the lumber business, I began to lose touch with winter, especially when my responsibilities at the Unitarian Universalist Association shifted towards working primarily and eventually exclusively with congregations south of the border. I spent enough time in southern states during the winter so that it ceased to have the effect on me that it did when I was younger. On the days when I wasn't working comfortably in my office at home, a place I called my study because that seemed warmer and more pastoral, but it was an office. Winter became something of a stroll through, something to stroll through on my walks to the grocery or when heading to the taxi on my way to the airport. I dressed for where I was going rather than where I was. And once I arrived in California or Texas, really any of the lower 48 states, I would regale people with embellished stories about the winter I had left behind and how they wouldn't be able to deal with it. That is until the Sunday I arrived late at church in Pennsylvania, a day after I had made fun of them for worrying about the big storm that was coming, the storm that was going to beat all storms. In fact, the first storm of the year 2001, when I was showing up to church to give my sermon that day, 2001, A Faith Odyssey. But then I found myself frozen out of my rental car by a quarter of an inch of ice that had descended during the night. Someone came to rescue me, and I strode up the aisle of the church just in time to deliver the reading before the sermon. As the congregation roared with laughter and just a hint of revenge, while one member called out, "Is winter here good enough for you yet?" My wandering years as an apostle of liberal religion left my body acclimated to the weather of an indeterminate place in the United States, perhaps somewhere in the middle of Kansas, and I became impatient with Winnipeggers whining about the weather, mostly because I rarely had to endure the deep cold for longer than a week at a time before I was headed off to somewhere where the grass grows year-round and they dig up their summer bedding plants to replace them with winter plants in season. Seriously. And then a decade ago, I left the UUA and got to experience my first interrupted Winnipeg winter in 2.5 decades. It was a mild winter, as I recall, but to the end of it, I felt like I was 17 all over again, foolishly dressed and afraid to step outdoors except to make a mad dash to the car. It took a couple of winters, maybe 3, before I rediscovered long underwear and warm hats, although I haven't returned to flannel shirts. Because there's already enough about my fashion sense to lead uninformed people to ask more often than you'd imagine if I'm Mennonite. Not that there's anything wrong with that particular stereotyped look. It's just that I'm aiming for a more generic, folksy style. A decade later, I've learned to love the winter again. With Shakespeare, I can proclaim, "My age is as lusty winter, frosty but kindly." That's a great line. My age is as lusty winter, frosty but kindly. This is a season to be savored for its cold and dark nights, when the sky is aglow with the moon and the stars, and the northern lights can occasionally be glimpsed, when the daylight hours are appreciated more deeply because they are so brief. It is truly a wonderland for those who brave the outdoors, at least on the nicest days, or watch the snowy landscape from inside, nurtured by crackling fires perhaps, and lubricated by warm beverages. It is a time to watch the wildlife that remains active on all but the coldest days, and perhaps even help it along by preserving natural shelters and leaving enough food on the ground or in the trees for them to make it until spring, no matter what the local bylaws may say. It is easy to miss the beauty and the bounty of this season, its warmth and its endless blessings. As the acclaimed painter Andrew Wyeth said, "I prefer winter and fall, when you feel the bone structure of the landscape, the loneliness of it, the dead feeling of winter, while reminding us something waits beneath it. The whole story doesn't show." So I will continue to shovel the snow with delight. I really do, although I do it more slowly than I once did. And with 2 young grandchildren, I have begun making snow angels again, although it's hard to get up unless I make them close to a tree or a fence I can hold on to when I'm done. But snow angels and grandchildren are worth it. And I'll lay down fresh straw each year as the snow approaches for the tiny creatures who find shelter there in my backyard. I will venture to the park and watch families skate on the duck pond, though I never learned to do so myself, and I will stop everything and just gaze when the hoarfrost appears. And I will venture to keep still and enjoy the quiet pleasures of life, reading books and stories about winter and the human spirit, and listening to the songs of the season, even as I taste winter's bounty more directly. I have discovered with John Boswell that winter, a lingering season, is a time to gather golden moments, embark upon a sentimental journey, and enjoy every idle hour. And so it is that I sing to winter a song of praise rather than a lament. Please join in hymn number 324, "Where My Free Spirit Onward Leads."